Hey all, welcome to DC Python Meetup. This is the main monthly meetup for February 2021. I'm Alex Clark, President, Executive Director of DC Python, a nonprofit whose entire purpose is to organize events, Python-related events in DC. And we used to do that in person. Now we do it virtually. Hopefully sometime in 2021, we'll go back to in-person. But I've scheduled myself for last Saturday of the month, every month, to be here and do this. And I've also got some of the other organizers showing up on Saturday morning in this spot instead of me. But in any event, let's keep events happening while we wait out this pandemic. If you appreciate the events and the content, please take a minute to donate. I'm going to paste the link in the chat. We do rely on donations to keep the organization running. Nobody donated last time, but the time before I got a couple. So please, if you appreciate the events, take a second, donate. And with that, oh, I forgot to mention before we started rolling, these meetings to me seem particularly well suited for the around the rooms, which I used to do back in the day and I like to do before we get started. So we've got about 8 people. Let's go around the room for anyone who would like to, and introduce yourself, tell us what you do with Python, then we'll get to Llewellyn and Josh. Thank you both for being here. So I'm Alex, I do Python. I also do system administration. I have a computer science degree, but I'm heavily a systems guy, more so than a software developer. Started with Plone CMS back in the day, mid 2000s, graduated to Django, started a business. My wife and I do software consulting. Python is still at the core of everything we do. Python and open source. So if there's one thing that I like to say I do professionally, I do other things, but one of the values I like to provide is to help organizations use open source. So that's me. And also, when you're done talking about yourself, pick another person to do an intro, and I picked Llewellyn.
Yes, hi, Llewellyn Jones, currently a data scientist, working in Python, everything, so to speak. Background, I was originally got my BS in mathematics, but I went into web development, worked in a lot of different programming languages back in the day, Perl and Cold Fusion and miscellaneous other things after that, but more recently moved into Python, worked with Django a lot, and more recently moved into sort of data science and data analytics, working for a couple of consulting firms in the last few years, and looking to do more with it.
Awesome, thank you. Pick a victim.
Next in the row, Josh.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Josh. Background web developer, community organizer, marketer. But you know, PHP was my primary language for the longest time. And it's still kind of my default, but these days when I'm hacking together a tool, it tends to be Python. It helps that my husband's on the Python Software Foundation board and organize PyCon Australia. And we co-organize North Bay Python here in our backyard.
What's his name? I probably know him.
Neugebauer, Christopher.
I know it doesn't ring a bell. I'll look him up.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
And I'll throw it to Mike.
Hello. Hi, my name's Mike. Hey. So I used to come out to DC Python a lot before. So at my office, they're moving into Python, and I actually taught some Python previously, and I wanted to get back into it. And so I run a meetup group called Stat Seminars, and so I do a lot of R, but I'm slowly going to be doing some more Python too on topics and stats. And yeah, and I like to read books. I do a lot of cooking, and yeah, that's me. Oh, but I just want to let you know, I'll only be here till 10:40, but I just definitely want to catch the DC Python your event today. So
Yeah, we appreciate it. And I remember you presenting in person when Hatch was doing events.
Yeah, yeah.
Not too
Yeah, I
long
love
ago.
using Python.
All right, pick a victim.
Okay. No, I won't be a victim. Let's go with Gary. Is Gary available?
Or if they don't respond, if nobody, oh, there he goes.
Hey, how you doing? Yep. So I'm still pretty green when it comes to Python. I just recently graduated a full stack web development course back in November. It was like 4 months long from Code and Dojo. Up to this point, I've just been trying to find group to join that pretty much helped me to expand my current knowledge. I am degreed or I have my bachelor's in cybersecurity. Currently work on a piece of software called Splunk. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Splunk uses a lot of Python scripts underneath. So I want to be able to do a lot of integrations with Splunk utilizing Python. So I'm pretty much just looking for all resources to help me expand my career with whole web development and with using Python.
Cool, man. Welcome. Pick a next
Guess
person.
I'll go with Kyle.
Hi, my name's Kyle Malka. I've been doing Python for over 10 years now. Right now I'm leading a team building a web application whose backend is in Python. I'm not actually doing much Python these days, but doing some code reviews and stuff. I did give a workshop for this meetup last year, actually a couple workshops. Hopefully I'll be able to do that again soon. And I think I'm going to host one coming up as well. So look out for that. Yeah.
You are you the Kyle that is the DC Python meetup organizer?
Yes, that is me.
Nice to meet you virtually, and thank you for stepping in to do one of these. I forget which month you picked, but awesome.
It's on my calendar, so I think it's May or June.
Yeah, the format's loose, so you don't have to do this. I just do this because I find it interesting to see what everyone does. And
cool.
All right, pick another.
Who hasn't gone? Paul?
Sure. Hi, I'm Paul. I'm actually up in Baltimore, not DC, but reasonably close, very virtually close, I guess. I used to work at HashiCorp on Terraform, if you're familiar with that. Right now, I'm currently unattached, a recovering open source maintainer, I guess. But I've been playing with some Python for some data stuff I've been messing around with, and just figured I'd hop in here and see what the group was like.
Sweet, welcome.
Pass it over to, let's see, Catherine.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I live in Gaithersburg. I was originally an economics major and actually did some computer simulations in my thesis work, written in BASIC, so that tells you how long ago that was. I then went to law school and practiced as a trusted estate lawyer for a while, and then took quite a bit of time off raising my children, and sort of wanted to shift away from law. And I have done a number of courses at Montgomery College in their continuing education in data science, Python, Java web development, and some front-end courses. But I decided to return to Python and data science as my sort of IT focus. And I don't have a job currently, but I've taken advantage of the past year of online webinars and have attended quite a high amount of them. So I look forward to continuing to develop my Python and data science skills.
Very cool, welcome. Did we hit everyone, or did we do Paul?
I think I'm the last guy. I'll jump in.
Okay, great.
So my name is Ben Bigelow. Right now I work as a data solutions manager for a healthcare software company. So I mostly do basically data integrations between our analytics platform and hospital data. So that's my day-to-day life. It's mostly SQL, some Python, but in my free time, I've been working on a Django project with some web scraping as well. So nice to meet all of you.
Very cool. Welcome all. The first one of these, a funny story real quick. The first one of these I did in late 2020, and I tried to live stream it and subsequently did a terrible job and wasn't able to capture the around the rooms, which I don't know if it's just me, but I find these very cool. And the fact that we can now go back and look at these over hopefully, 12 months or so is going to be cool. All right, so Llewellyn, take it away. And you have not so much a main talk as in between a lightning and a main talk maybe. And then Josh, you have in between or some type of main talk-ish. It's 20 after. Anyway, take it away, Llewellyn. Thanks all. Oh, do I have to allow sharing? Because last time I got dinged on that.
I think you have to make the person the host if you're, yeah, if you're using Zoom, you have to make the person a co-host so they can present.
Actually, or you can do who can share all participants.
No.
So that should do it. You got your sharing button, Llewellyn?
Yep.
Okay, great.
One second here, it's not. Had this before. Let's try that again. All right. Yeah. Thanks, Alex, for setting it up. Yeah, as I said, it's a relatively short talk. It's mainly something that grew out of a project a couple of years ago for Department of Education, where we were trying to do some data analysis and modeling on a pretty large data set, and it was simulation modeling with a machine learning model within that. And it was very performance intensive. Like we were sort of set to, it might take like a week to run the model, depending on how things worked out. And we were sort of scratching our heads for a lot of different ways to improve performance. Essentially, we only had one like large server to work from. It was a very robust server. There's no doubt about that, multi-core GPU and everything like that. But we really wanted to find out every way that we could save some time, because not just the week of running the model, but we were going to be doing a lot of testing. And if each one of those tests was going to run hours, if not a day, just to sort of get some feedback to change the model, then the whole project was going to take a really long time. And so we're sort of looking at ways that we could improve anything in that process. So here's the situation. It's a large data set with a large complex computational task. Again, it was modeling and analysis and data cleaning. And we had limited computational assets and limited time. We weren't going to be able to spin up additional servers, go to AWS for this project. That could be a situation. I could see just if you have a lot of money, or just have that availability to just say, oh, let's do 10 AWS servers or some variation on that, or some other cloud service, then that would not be a problem, and you could just spin that up. You don't have to worry about the code. But we were looking at how we could improve the code to improve performance. In this situation, it was like a 1 terabyte data set. A lot of the times we were working on samples. We were just doing a sample just to see what it looked like when you're random sampling, and just to get, and that worked for a lot of situations. But again, it was still running very, very slow for testing, and we need to figure something better out. We were training a machine learning model. It was a simulation model that in one of the steps in the simulation, it runs a machine learning model. So we still had to train that machine learning model plus the simulation modeling. And that simulation model was, it was complex time-based steps. So it was doing a lot of different things at loop. It essentially is one giant loop, for loop sort of, and then a lot of logical steps within there. We had a powerful multi-core server, as I mentioned before, but it was not extendable. We weren't going to be able to set up Spark and Hadoop because of the time constraints, and sort of it's a government consulting project, so we weren't going to, at least for this project, it wasn't available. There's probably a gazillion possibilities of ways you can improve performance, but this is the subset of things that we were looking at. I'm probably missing a bunch of different things, like there's a bunch of, you can do different Python compilers. We didn't look at that. I mean, we looked at like Python and Numba, but there's other ones that you can like CPython versus the regular Python compilers. I didn't get into that level, and so I can't speak to it. Don't know enough about it. But here's the list. Looked at parallelization, Python, Vex, I'm actually not totally sure how to pronounce it, Dask, Numba, and this one that I'll get to. This is something I sort of stumbled upon that seems to be kind of unique as far as I've found out, and that it really did improve performance pretty considerably, and I'll go through that in some detail. Why not Spark and Hadoop? They are super powerful, but again, for this project is, it means setting up a Spark server, different environment configuration, a lot of time sink into that. And, it's a unique programming language and had limited syntax. For another project, it might be great. Lots of projects use it, of course, but it wasn't available for this one. So parallelization, that one was kind of obvious, easy to implement, multi-processing library. You just essentially set up your pool of, and you set it to use as all of the cores that are available. And that one was just kind of an obvious one. You just do that, and it was easy to implement. The code out there is maybe like 4 lines long or something, and easy to do. For the model training, it's a little more complicated. Only certain sklearn models have the parallelization built in, the sort of n jobs equals -1 flag. And using that is super easy. You just pass that flag, and there's no problem. But if you want like the full suite of machine learning models, it gets complicated after that. We just kept, for this project, we were just sort of limiting the model to, I think it was a random forest. Somebody else was working on the model training end of that, and that had the njobs flag, and that worked out. In a lot of other situations, I could see that being more complicated situation. But for us, adding parallelization was, it was a gimme. Python was our first, what we were first looking at for speed improvements. And in a lot of situations, there's 10 to 100 times faster performance. But for us, we were seeing inconsistent speed performance. Like in one set of code, it was like a 10-fold improvement. In other situations, not as much. It really depended on what code it was running. And that has, there's something under the hood that I can't really speak to about like how it was, which kinds of functions made that improvement, how it maybe is like memory issues or something like that. It was very inconsistent. And we were running into some big issues with the implementation of Python, that in some basic code, Python is very easy to implement. It's essentially you all of your variables need to be defined as like C variables. It has like these CDEF instead of def for functions, and some other ones for variables. Once the code started getting more complicated, that it needed other things to happen. Essentially, we wound up sort of like recoding our Python as almost C code, and it wound up getting more and more complicated, and we weren't seeing the speed improvements that we were originally seeing. If you do like a sort of a basic test of like Python versus Python for like a like a Fibonacci sequence, you'll see a huge speed improvement. But once we were like having multiple libraries, and we were trying to pull in Python libraries, and the Python libraries need to be Pythonized as well, then it was really we were hitting a dead end there. We were just like, this is going to be a lot of work to Pythonize all this code, and it's just we're not seeing the improvement, and so it wasn't going to work out for us. I could see that in a lot of situations it could be a huge improvement, but for us, it wasn't going to work. So Vakes, we're very excited about this one. We didn't want to use it for this project, but it's really interesting. It's this out of core data frame processing like Pandas-Like. I've been using it all the time for local, running things on my local machine, because if you don't have like a gigantic amount of memory available and you need to run like a data set that's like 3 gigabytes or bigger, then you kind of need it. Essentially, it's what it does is, rather than doing the sort of vector-based approach that Pandas does, it's essentially just doing looping over the data set, just almost like a simple for loop. And so it doesn't load in the whole data set into memory. And by doing that, you avoid needing that huge memory footprint. And it worked pretty well. Like if you just need, like you got a 100 gigabyte file and you just want to get the average value of a column, if you're using that in Pandas, you got to load that whole thing into memory, and then do the get the mean of it, and just loading it into memory, that'll take some time. But Vakes does it really quickly. But so it's pretty awesome for those kinds of situations. But it doesn't. It's not, the speed improvement is kind of selective. If you're doing sort of like analysis stuff, it was great. But doing more complicated things, doing like a lot of cleaning, it had some issues. We weren't seeing the speed improvements. It's interesting, but it just wasn't for this project. But definitely interested to use it some more. Dask, we were really hoping for Dask would come through. It's this distributed Pandas-Like library. Again, it's for like high memory situations, large data sets where you don't have a lot of memory available. So you can distribute to different cores or different servers, all of the processing involved. Again, memory is not an issue for a lot of projects these days. If you do have like a robust server, a big GPU system, you could use it locally and things like that, where you're testing things out and you don't have a lot of memory available. But yeah, again, memory is not the issue. It's more performance, it's more CPU, and Dask was not helping with that. That it's interesting, and I could see it for certain situations, but we're talking CPU, not memory issues, and it was more complicated to code in than straight Pandas. But it was more Pandas-like than Vakes. That was a good benefit there, but it didn't help us out in the situation. Numba, this one I actually found out about after the project. Very interesting, very easy to implement. It's just-in-time compiler, essentially just compiles that Python code into I think it's bytecode as you run it, which is great. You don't have to, like with Python, you have to compile the code separately. So it's like just like an extra step every time you're testing anything. This one, you don't have to do that. And the code is super easy. It's essentially, it's just a decorator in Python. So it's almost like a, why not use it? It doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of different code. It's like certain NumPy functions and other pandas functions and things like that. But it's, again, it's like parallelization. It's like, it's when it's that easy to implement, why not just do it and get a better performance out of it. And lastly, this is this one that I stumbled upon that I call recursive factorization. It's essentially just using vectorization, that essentially, like, pandas-like functions on a vector with recursion at the same time. Sort of, and I'll get into that, what that means. Recursion, it's, pretty obvious. It's like Fibonacci sequence. It's a function that calls itself. And usually recursion is slow in programming, that it just has something to do, hopefully I can describe this right, but it's how a lot of programming languages use the call stack, that when it's, rather than putting something into like regular memory, it's putting it into the functional memory. And for whatever reason, that references to the call stack are slower than just references to variable values stored in memory. That's as far as I know, my understanding of it. As I did say, I stumbled upon it as I was trying things out, and and I came across it, and it does seem to really help. So recursion is slow, but when you pair it with the sort of the benefits of doing things by factorization, the way that pandas and NumPy do it, that they're essentially doing these computations across the whole vector essentially at the same time, and that the benefits of doing recursion with vectorization, the vectorization benefits outweigh the recursion, and you get a decent performance benefit out of that. That essentially what it's doing is it's applying a recursive function to each row in the vector at the same time. So it's sort of doing all those calculations at the same time. The recursion's still slow, but it's not slow enough to slow down the whole process. And that's better than for simulation modeling, we're looping through just that, it's a basic for loop is essentially what the heart of the function is. And you can avoid that for loop slowness by doing it this way. And essentially the way we were doing it is, creating, using object-oriented programming, we're creating a class that has recursive methods within it. And there might be other ways to do this. I've been trying to think about how to also get it to the sort of like decorator level where you just slap on a decorator to a function and it, sort of would apply this by itself. But we're creating a class with recursive methods. There's multiple recursive methods just because we had a bunch of different logic. They were breaking up. And then applying that class to each row in the data set, in the vector of data. So essentially it's like applying a recursive function to each row of the data simultaneously. And so, and then that gets, it's a little bit unintuitive, and it was a little sort of complicated to think about at times, but again, it was getting a tenfold performance improvement over just the for loop as we were doing it. And it performed better than iteration with Python for the code that we were working with. Handled large data without memory complications. The downsides were that the recursion could be complicated to think about. It's like, it's easier to sort of look at a for loop and see the time steps. You'd be like, oh, it's doing this, this, and this. With the recursion, it was sort of like, there's no set order to it. It's like, you got to jump from one function to another function to another function. That was also part of how we were organizing it. that could be cleaned up. But in general, recursion's a little more complicated to think about than sort of just a regular straight, list, a for loop list of operations. And also you have to watch out for infinite loops, sort of essentially, it's recursing, I don't even know what the word is, going back on itself.
Maximum recursion.
Was
limit.
that?
Max recursion limit reached.
Yes, you can hit that max recursion limit. But essentially, that's more a problem of you need to make sure that you have, what happens when it hits 0. So it's like recursively going from, like, say it's going from 100 to 0 in time steps. So it's going, you calculate from 0 to 100 and it goes, at point 100, look to 99, at 99, look to 98. And what happens is you just need to put in limits at 0. So it says when it gets to 0, like the value is 0. Don't go to infinity, negative infinity. And once you have those sort of limits set in, then it'll work fine. But that is something, it's kind of complicated to think about and to make sure that those are there and the values are the way you want them to. And it's a variation on how you do it with a for loop, like if time step is 0, the value is 0 or something like that. But again, yeah, it's a little more complicated, but something I came across, I thought I kind of liked the, spread it around for the open source community, that if this might help somebody, if get a 10-fold performance improvement, I hope it helps.
That was awesome. I know it was good because I felt like I was preparing for a technical interview. My head hurts. So thank you very much. Was that a wrap on that? Any questions for Llewellyn? Could I see just the overview, the beginning slide real quick?
This one or
yeah, you just had it.
This one?
No, the all the list of different, yeah, that one. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, there's a million other things. There's just code improvement. There's a million different things of how you do things in pandas that can improve performance. This is probably a very limited set of possibilities.
Yeah, when you, I think the first one made me think of this, which I'm pasting, which is where a guy took the Python imaging library and made it do parallelization, I think. Anyway, that link's kind of interesting and related. And for number 6, there's no libraries, right? It's just you just use Recursion. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really just setting up a custom class that uses recursive methods. So I've been trying to make it into like a library that could be open sourced.
Oh, right.
Make it as like a decorator, but I haven't gotten around to it yet.
So yeah, 1 and 6 are like, maybe there's some libraries for 1, maybe there's some libraries for 6.
Yeah, I can, the multi-processing library, Python library. There's a few of them that do this.
Just curious.
Do you have any recommended resources for learning more about recursive factorization?
Yeah, there's not a ton, I'll say that. There's a lot of things about recursion that you can look up.
Yeah, like I've done recursion a bunch, but I don't know how to do it with vectorization.
Looks like the closest thing on the internet is a MATLAB link, which is kind of interesting. I just pasted it.
A Medium story that I wrote about this. I'll post in the chat. It has a little more detail.
Anyway, thank you, Llewellyn, and Josh, take it away whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Okay. So while Llewellyn took us deep into internals, I'm
Yeah.
gonna take us the other direction in the stack, out of the machine and into what I like to call the hidden infrastructure, or the foundations of open source. Really, we're going to talk about the organizations that make all of the stuff that we do possible, basically. Let's see, I need to adjust my screen here. I've still got the shared screen thing going on. Awesome. Sweet, thank you. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for having me, Alex. I really appreciate the invitation. Even if I'm a backup, like I'm always looking for. I'm a bit of a ham. I love giving presentations, and I'm stoked to be here. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then what we're going to talk about. So my name is Josh. I am the president of the Open Source Initiative. It's a nonprofit. We'll learn a little bit more about it later. My day job is I work as an ecosystem strategy lead at Tidelift. We're a company that pays maintainers and gets paid by companies who want to know that the open source software that they're using really does have the license they say it does, is maintained, has responsible security disclosure policies and all that good stuff. So really, we basically do managed open source for companies and just take the money that we get from them and give that to maintainers. Another thing that I do, a hat that I wear most years, not during the pandemic though, is that I'm a co-organizer of North Bay Python, which is on the other coast, but it is the cutest damn little Python conference I've ever been to. Certainly, we hold it out of a concert venue, an 1800s concert venue, I should say. Anywho, so I came to open source late in my career. I was I got my start as a web developer. I was that kid who would like fix your family's printer or something, and then at some point people started looking to me to like build websites because I had started dabbling in HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And by the time I graduated high school, I had already been doing like freelance web development for a few years. I won't say effectively, I wasn't a good business person, but I was making an income. I went off to college, and I just couldn't pass muster. I couldn't work my way through it. Didn't have enough in the way of loans, so I dropped out because I already had a career on my hands, and I just thought, like, okay, let me lean into this. It seems to be working for me, and so that's what I did. I moved back home up here to Sonoma County, and I spent about 5 years, I think, freelancing, running a small agency, working with other agencies, running user groups, all that. And it's so funny because at no point in that process did I realize that that the fact that there was free software that I could use and customize and then sell, there was no point at which I thought that was novel. It's just kind of like fish in water. This is just how web development works. And I had grew up alongside peer-to-peer file sharing and user-generated content websites, and so open source felt like an extension of all that. I didn't realize, like, oh no, there's something really novel here, and the licensing just a few years ago was literally considered radical. So even though today I'm the president of the Open Source Initiative, rewind 8 years, and like I don't even really know what open source is, and I certainly don't know what the Open Source Initiative is. And so this is why one of the topics that I'm passionate about, and the one I'm talking about today, is hidden infrastructure, the foundations of open source. Because there are lots of nonprofits, there are lots of organizations, not the Google or the Amazon or the Facebook or whatnot, but the Python Software Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, the Open Source Initiative. You know, there's this whole ecosystem of nonprofit organizations that are critical to the way that our careers operate, to the way that programming functions, and most people don't know about them. So that's the drum that I beat. So here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about Open Source Initiative. I'm going to talk a little about open source. I'm going to talk a little bit about other foundations, and my hope, though I see that we are mostly video off right now, and no pressure, that's okay. I am hoping to have this be an interactive discussion, right? Like I get no particular joy out of like broadcasting to people for hours on end. You know, there's plenty of that. I wanna ask some questions, learn from you as well. So
I will
thank you in
interact with
advance.
you.
Yes, excellent. And let me tell you now that like the questions I ask, there are no, okay, maybe there are some wrong answers, but there are a lot of right answers. And I'm never going to be playing gotcha. Like, I'm not going to make an example of you. Like, I really like, I want to know what you think, because this is both like, this is bi-directional learning is the way that I look at it. Oh yeah, and as you can tell, I don't have a deck. This is just a conversation. So let me tell you a little, actually, no, let me start with a question. Who here has heard of the Open Source Initiative? You can raise your hands, use a react emoji or something. Yeah, a few people. Cool. Okay. Does anybody want to take a stab at what OSI does?
I'll take a stab, and it truly is a stab because I've known OSI for a long time and just sort of thought of it like GNU or any of these other long time open source thingies. And so it's a advocate. It's probably more than this, hence the stab term, but it's an advocate for open source and a source of truth or definitiveness in terms of open source business, which is licensing and probably some other things. But so that's I haven't looked this up recently, but that's kind of what I think it is.
That's better than what I usually hear. So that's great. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. OSI is an organization that is an advocate for open source, and does provide a standard for licenses known as open source licenses, right? So yeah, let me tell you a little bit about what OSI does, and where we've been. OSI was founded in '98. Don't worry, I'm not going to go over 22 years of history here, 23 years. It's founded in '98 at the, like just a few months after the term open source was coined. The co-founders of OSI were in the room. They were part of that movement. One of the co-founders of OSI was the one who drafted the open source definition based on the Debian free software guidelines, based on the 4 freedoms for people who care about where those things come from. So yeah, the OSI has the 10-point open source definition, and that is a standard for licenses. It tells us things like, for a license to be considered open source, it must not discriminate against field of endeavor. It must, okay, I'm not gonna be able to rattle off the definition off the top of my head. Probably bore you anyways. But the bottom line is it's a standard, and we use it to measure licenses and ascertain whether a license really is open source or not. And not only does OSI maintain the open source definition, but it also maintains the license review process, right? Because new licenses are being written more often than you might think, and people will submit those licenses to OSI for consideration as an open source license. And the license review process, I'll say, it's conducted in the open. It's a public process. It's a mailing list. Anyone can join and participate. And the idea is that at the end of that process, we make a decision that no, we as a community and as the board of OSI don't feel this is open source, or yes, it is. And we're then going to add it to our approved license list. And this is not exciting stuff. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I have no illusions about how interesting this is. Even the lawyers that we work with in this space don't necessarily find it that exciting. But that's the point. That's exactly the point, is that the open source initiative does the legal, the way I think about it is like the legal janitorial work. Like we do the support work that allows legal professionals at for-profit companies, humanitarian organizations, government agencies. It allows all of them to rely on the open source definition, that sort of external thing. They can just say, like, if a license meets this definition, then you can use that software component in our work. Having a reliable, predictable license standard means that these organizations don't need to do manual legal review of every single third-party software component. Because if we didn't have a license standard, then everything is going to have a novel license, and they need to review that just to make sure like there's no sneaky terms in there that are going to be problematic for their business or the way they operate. So not only is this like really meaningful for like large organizations, but gosh, this is like a big deal for independent professionals, for small businesses, for researchers, for hobbyists, because it means that like I was able to start my career selling a Drupal, and that was perfectly legal. Like there was nothing wrong with what I was doing. The license allowed me to do that. If the license were different, might not have been the case. The nice thing is that as a solo operator, because there was such a body of work around this standard, I could trust like, okay, I know what my rights are here. So that's like the core of what OSI does. Yeah, it does a lot of other things. It does do advocacy. We are part of authoring the federal open source policy from 2 administrations ago. We've been involved with open source voting in California, standards at the European Commission, trying to make sure that when new policies are written, particularly around copyright, because that's what licenses mostly concern themselves with, is copyright. Trying to make sure that new policy that gets written around this stuff doesn't like close the door on open source. Let me tell you, that happens surprisingly often. Like every year, OSI is like speaking to some commission, some government, somewhere saying like, no, this provision in this law is going to break the whole industry. So OSI is both doing like the legal janitorial work as well as the advocacy work to make sure that open source continues being a thing we can all rely on. So we may be a 23-year-old nonprofit, but we are a tiny operation. I got peers at like I got a peer at Indeed. And one of like my favorite people, name is Dwayne O'Brien, and he leads open source there. And a few years ago, he ran for the Open Source Initiative Board of Directors, and he was talking to me like, "Hey, I want to learn more about the organization so that I can make an effective platform and be effective when I join the board." And part of that discussion was like telling him what our annual budget was like, what the size of our organization was like, and he was shocked. Because here he is at a giant company, and he's learning from me that OSI, this nonprofit that like is the foundation of this whole ecosystem in some ways, the whole like edifice of modern software development. And it comes down to a nonprofit with a single full-time employee with an annual budget under $500,000 a year. Half of that, by the way, isn't even our money. It's one of our member projects. We don't get to touch that. Like it's restricted funds. So it's like $250,000 a year. That's basically someone's salary, and then like some production materials, and then travel. We're a tiny operation. And we are trying to grow. We are trying to grow to a 3 or 4 or 5 person, small but mighty staff. But that's just not what we are right now. So it's a tiny operation. We're a charitable nonprofit, C3 for people who are nerds about tax law in the US. that means that we cannot be an extension of for-profit activities. That means basically that that helps us guard against being manipulated. You know, when OSI was founded, Microsoft was the boogeyman. You know, the things that they were saying about open source, describing it as a cancer, like, whoa, like there were some well-moneyed threats when open source first came on the scene. And so it was really important to incorporate as a charitable nonprofit to just add an extra layer of protection against manipulation. And now, while Microsoft is clearly like different beast today, at least in terms of their attitudes on open source, the threats haven't really changed that much. You know, maybe they're a little harder to see, but they're there. So it's important that OSI remain a charitable nonprofit to guard against sort of that being bought and played. So OSI, it's a fully elected board. There are 10 of us. In fact, you can join as an individual member. We charge like $40 a year, or we give membership away for free for anybody who's impacted or as a student. You know, we're not trying to like make money out of people. Most of our money comes from sponsorship. But if you become a member before March 4th, you'll be able to vote in our next election. And you'll be able to choose who is on the board of directors. We're going to vote we're electing 4 directors this year. And that brings home like my final point about OSI in this segment is like, it's an organization that is like of the community, by the community, for the community. I know like, you know, we hear those things often, but like it's true. Now that said, to many people, OSI is like this shadowy cabal, like who the hell are these people? How did they get there? What are they doing? They're all good questions. We haven't done a great job communicating those answers. And the reality is that OSI, open source used to be small. Like, believe it or not, open source used to be tiny. And you would know a lot of the people in it. And so it was fine at that time to have organizations where you just kind of traded on who you knew. But times have changed. You know, the industry is massive. And open source is like the de facto development approach these days. It's the standard. And OSI hasn't evolved enough alongside that change. And so now, you know, we're still like of, by, and for the community. But to be honest, if you don't happen to know someone who is on the OSI board of directors, you probably don't know what we do, you probably don't know who we are, and you probably don't know how to get engaged. And so this is a problem, is that like for too long, we have relied on the casual privilege of just knowing the right person. And that's not going to get us into the next 10 or 20 years in like a sustainable and equitable fashion. Like that's not okay. So we're working on that. And that's sort of our big project right now. So I want to talk a little bit now about open source itself. You know, I talked about the open source definition and what that means for licenses. But I don't know if you've spent any amount of time in this industry and like, you know, heaven forbid you're on Twitter or reading headlines, you've probably got a sense that there's not complete agreement on what open source is. And we may have an open source definition, but people are still talking about like, what is open source? So I want to talk a little about that. And I want to give, I'm hoping 1 or 2 people are willing to tell us what open source means to them.
Yes, I'm one of those people. I don't have to go first, but I can tell you. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, take it away.
All right, open source is, I grew up, I'm old, let's see. It took me about 10 years to get my undergrad and I got it in the late 90s. And I had a bit of the same reaction as Josh described, where there was all this stuff happening with people sharing source code So it was very closely tied to my education, my computer science education. So you went in the Unix lab and you compiled some window managers, and it was fun. And so I was a terrible student, but I had the Unix lab and I managed to get, get my degree and do the math, do what I needed to do. But really it was the being in the Unix lab, the big DEC stations in the 90s that really sold me on. And so there's also, there's a little bit of this, wow, this is cool, this is great, this is, now that I'm aware of this, everything is solved. But then you realize, it's a little bit, not to get too political, because open source is, there's a lot of work to do, like you described. Your organization needs to continue to advocate, and everything is not perfect. So so open source is that good thing that I described, and then it's also that ongoing challenge of how it fits into the world today. And as you were just talking, I looked up, what is it that I remember about OSI? And then I remembered the OSI versus GNU thing,
Right.
which is a terminology thing. And I gotta say, the free thing doesn't resonate particularly well with me.
Right.
But anyway, so I don't want to take up too much time, but so the open source is, and also I am open source. I think I for some reason really identify with that community and culture. So I'm open source as much as I am Python. It's a part of my identity.
I love to hear that. Does anybody else want to give it a stab?
Sure.
Yeah, Kyle.
I guess I'll give you a little bit about my background. I started programming, like, well, I guess some people call it programming, some people don't, but making websites with HTML and CSS. I guess when I started doing it, CSS didn't exist, so it was more like, other ways of doing it.
Right.
But yeah, then I started, using PHP and took classes and got my computer science degree. But on the side, besides my classes, I was doing PHP and then switched to Python at some point. But yeah, I was always like kind of anti, specifically Microsoft, but just wanted to use open source as a way to kind of guarantee I could go back and like change stuff if I needed to. So it wasn't a black box. It was like, yeah, like I could take this piece of code and use it, but if I ever needed to modify it, I could. And like I had that like security of like, if this maintainer didn't stop supporting it, or if this company like went out of business or whatever, I could, bring it in if I needed to, or easily like just tweak some stuff. And so that's kind of what I think about open source, is the way to kind of ensure that you can go in and do what you need to do to continue keeping your app alive and secure and stuff like that.
I love these answers. Thank you, Alex and Kyle. I appreciate it. Llewellyn?
Yep. Yeah, I just sort of go on what Kyle was saying there, that I just really don't like the sort of black box approach to software that, back when just sort of everything was Microsoft, and essentially from the developer point of view, that you essentially just had to sort of, you bought the software, usually in those large boxes that they used to have, and you weren't there to sort of figure out how to make it work. You just looked at the instructions. You sort of looked at, they told you how to do it, and if you came to a dead end, you're kind of stuck. And in the open source world, I think it's more developer oriented, where you can sort of, you're figuring out how to do it, and there's a lot more resources available. And I think it's really has led to better products, better things. Python in general, I think, has just been great. It's just keeps growing in popularity over and over. And I mean, I think there are some downsides to the open source world. I think that certain business models get disrupted that shouldn't. I'm against the free model as well. but I really think it has just led to better code, better products, and better working environments.
That's awesome. I appreciate that perspective. Paul?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of expand probably a little bit, just a recent experience of mine that I thought was, I thought about, but I hadn't really fully considered the impact is, I think copyright law wise with works for hire, especially someone who recently left the company, all of that work I can still take with me and keep working on, I mean, copyright, I can't potentially change the license or depending on impact things there, but my work on the tools I was working on didn't start at the company, it started before it. I joined the company and then I can continue afterwards. And I think it's useful to have that kind of continuity, which is a thing I'm really appreciating now about it.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the perspectives, y'all. This is these are all things that I appreciate about open source. So this is one of the things with open source these days, that open source has been so successful that the phrase itself, and I should say, open source, we may have adapted it for use in terms of licensing and software, but open source formerly was an intelligence community phrase, and it still is. Open source intelligence is like any intelligence you can collect that's just public in the open. So there are the dual meanings of open source. Open source has been so successful, it has become the default like software development approach. It's the default licensing when you're doing something on your own, and you want to collaborate with people. But its success has actually become like kind of a threat. and what I mean by that is like open source is so successful that everybody has their own relationship with open source, and we don't necessarily have consensus on what it means anymore. And one of the things that OSI that's so important about open source is that open source definition gives us a shared agreement that we may disagree around business models, or we may disagree around like the languages we want to use, or what have you. But if we can agree on these terms, that open source licenses are these kinds of licenses, then we can interact very seamlessly. We can collaborate with minimal friction. Open source means a whole lot more than that now these days. Not only does open source refer to the license in a formal sense, and that's what OSI is primarily concerned about. Open source also refers to open collaboration, right? Like, can I contribute to your project? Can I open an issue on your project? Can I submit a pull request to your project and help improve it? Is there an open collaboration there? And then is there open governance, which is the next sort of layer on top of that. And that is like, okay, well, how are decisions made about the project roadmap? Who owns the intellectual property for this project ultimately? How do we use funds when the project receives funds? And all of these things, open source, open collaboration, open governance, all of these things have sort of been overloaded into the word open source. And I don't want to go back. I like that open source implies all those things. But it's just important to know that when we say open source, it has all these layers of meanings. And when we're in dialogue with somebody, if we're not clear on what our meanings are, what we mean when we say open source, often we'll end up talking past each other. So like all these things are great, but there's a conception out there, particularly of people who got into the industry the way I did, web developers in particular, who have a very different understanding of open source. There are lots of people out there who think if I can see the source code, it is open source. The source is open. I can see it. How's that not open source? I'm here to tell you that while there are lots of right answers, that is the one wrong answer. There's a word for that, and we call that source available. Source available licensing means you can see the code. It is not open source. There's nothing wrong with that. Open source isn't like the only way. It's different, and that's okay. But it's important to be clear about that, because if I say I have an open source project and I've got a source available license on it, and you come to use the project or contribute to the project with the thought that it's open source, even though it's not, you're going to have different expectations about what your rights are, about what you're actually allowed to do with that software. And you don't want to find yourself in a position using some software that you thought was open source that wasn't actually, and suddenly you're on the hook for giant license fees, or you're on the hook for like, oh no, you're not allowed to use the software in this way. You need to upgrade to our proprietary license and get a commercial agreement with us. This is why it's so important for us to have like some mutual understanding of the words that were of these phrases and definitions. And again, I want to be really clear. I'm not knocking non-open source licenses. I'm just saying there are things that aren't open source, and we need to make sure that we're like crisp about definitions, because the consensus is what allows us to be so free in the use of tools and technologies. If you pull a package down from pip, you can be reasonably sure it's open source, not source available, and that's meaningful. But there are all these things you get out of open source, like back in the day, you get a toaster, you get the schematic with it, right? Like you can crack that thing open and work on the circuitry in it if it goes bad. And that was not only good for like repairing things, but it was also good for and I don't know if any security researchers were worried about toasters, but open source is also good for security, because a researcher can crack it open, examine it, and verify like, oh, there are no backdoors in this toaster or this piece of software. So like, open source is nice for those reasons. It's also nice because pulling on a point that Llewellyn made, there is, oh wow, I had to lose my train of thought at some point. It is 8 a.m. over here. One of the other things that's nice about open source is that it's not a black box, that it is a thing that you can come back to and use. I was a freelancer doing work for hire for many years, and most of the code I wrote wasn't open source, and I can never see that code again because it's not mine. That kind of sucks. I like being able to see the fruits of my labor and be able to use them again later. Open source also has a lot to do with free culture and open culture movements. We've seen in the wake of open source, these licenses, we now see Creative Commons, which is, it's not open source. Actually, they have one license that is arguably would fit the open source definition, but none of them are officially vetted as open source. But Creative Commons was inspired by the open source movement, and the open source movement was inspired by the free software movement. And all of this was about open culture and freedom. And these are our roots. Now, open source today, the flip side of that freedom, that got the software freedom movement going was, okay, well, these licenses mean that a business can use the software and not pay license fees. Okay, well, users may love freedom, businesses love free. And so that's where we get open source, and that's why we've seen this model of licensing become so successful. All right. I spent long enough on this point, and I know I only have a little more time left. Who here is familiar with the Python Software Foundation and has some thoughts about what it might do? Awesome. Let's start with Kyle.
So I understand the Python Software Foundation as being the holder of the Python trademark, and also kind of manages like pip and PyPI and the infrastructure behind kind of packages, and also like manages the the evolution of the language itself and C Python, the default implementation.
That's exactly right.
Well,
Do you want
yeah.
to? Do you want to add anything to that, Alex?
I came to the PSF via the Plone Foundation, which was the software that got me into Python, and so it was a natural, process, because I recognized that the Plone Foundation was protecting the Plone software, and so therefore, when I came across the PSF, it was like, oh, okay, so dude wrote some software, it got big. You can go the private corporate, commercial route, or you can go the open source route. And when you go the open source route, a lot of times there's a foundation or some, nonprofit associated with it to protect it. Not in Drupal's case, or if it is, there's a little bit, there's more to the story there. But so yeah, and I've dealt with the PSF. I've gotten a grant, at least one grant, I think, for Pillow. And I started, a nonprofit myself with my wife to do advocacy. So in the case of the PSF, they're protecting Python. And I know one last thing I'll add is I know that they recently got big enough to add one full-time person, I guess, within the past 5 or 10 years or so.
That's right. That's right. It's one of my former colleagues from O'Reilly Media. She's awesome. So yeah, these are both exactly right. The Python Software Foundation holds the intellectual property, operates bank accounts, provides legal services to support those projects. They run grants programs to fund work, not only of people doing work that's really key to the ecosystem, but people who are trying to advocate for Python and educate new people. The grants program, for instance, gives no small amount of money out to programs that are trying to bring underrepresented people into tech. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just want to, this is a thing that this is near and dear to my heart. So I can't walk by this without acknowledging it. Open source. It's not controversial to say that the tech industry, the tech craft has a diversity and representation problem. It's not controversial, it's true. Open source, and I'm not proud of this, open source is worse. Open source is even less diverse. And there are lots of reasons for that. None of them are good. But one of the reasons for that is that open source historically has required the privilege of free time, right? And who's got free time? People who aren't working 2 jobs, who aren't working 1 job and then taking care of their kids or their parents. Free time is a luxury. And so much of the participation in open source, it reflects that. Now, the good news is a lot of more people are getting paid to work on open source. And so the demographics are changing. We're also getting better at building more welcoming communities that aren't actively hostile to other people and people who are unlike us. And then there are a lot of great outreach programs like Django Girls, like Pie Ladies, like Outreachy. And Outreachy, another thing I can't walk by without acknowledging, is an internship program for women, non-binary people, and people of color who can get paid to spend a season working on open source software and be paired with a mentor while doing so. So highly recommend checking out Outreachy or letting people know about it. It's a great way to work your way into the industry, to learn, to get paid, to build some connections and some skills. All right, so yeah, the Python Software Foundation does all these things for Python. Oh, and it puts on PyCon too, or PyCon US at least, no big deal. And these nonprofits are essential because they provide that infrastructure for projects. They provide a home for projects. Linux has a home, Git has a home with Software Freedom Conservancy. The original web server, Apache HTTP, belongs to the Apache Software Foundation. And so there are these nonprofits where that hold these software projects that we all rely on, that we all use. I mean, who's not using Git? Seriously. And this gets the reason foundations are so important. You know, brings. I want to circle back to the definition of open source, or the many meanings of open source. You know, so great, you have an open source license on a project. If you never share that code anywhere, you know, I can have an open source project on my local machine with, you know, a license in that folder that's an open source license. Even if nobody in the world has ever seen that other than me, it's an open source project. It's got an open source license on it. It doesn't feel open source though, does it? Because you can't see the code. You can't submit a pull request to it. You can't use it. So it's like, it's technically open source, but doesn't really feel open source. So not only does open source mean like the license and then making sure that this stuff is shared and usable and we can collaborate with it, but the open governance component is a part that I want to highlight here. You look at open source projects like it's easy to pick on Elastic right now. I'm not any copyright holder has the right to right to license their software any way they want. I'm not going to make a judgment of that, but I'm going to use them as an example because there's a cautionary tale here. Elastic is a company with some open source projects, Elasticsearch and Kibana, for example. Those were recently relicensed to the server-side public license, away from the Apache 2 license. The Apache 2 license is an open source license. The server-side public license is a source available license. They're different. That's fine. There's no problem with that. But here is the problem. That software was open source for many years. And in fact, as recent as last year, Elastic's CEO had explicitly promised that the software would remain open source in perpetuity. And yet, as a company with investors, as a company that needs to make an income and a return that will make those investors happy, they were under great pressure to increase revenue and profit. And it is clear that by the decision that they've made to relicense, what they've done is they've relicensed their software from open source to proprietary. And maybe that's the right business decision for them. I'm not here to judge that decision. But what I'm telling you is that if you were a person who is using this open source software and you were relying on it, and suddenly they've relicensed it and all future versions are not going to be open source anymore, well, like, good luck. Good luck if you can't use the version that's under commercial license. Good luck if you can't afford it. Good luck if your lawyers aren't comfortable with the source available license. And you know, if you were somebody who contributed to the project because it was open source, even though you weren't an Elastic employee, part of that contribution is you signed a contributor license agreement as part of it, and you assigned the copyright for your work to Elastic. So, you know, even if you've contributed to the project, even if you spend who knows how many hours writing code that goes into Elastic with the expectation that you would be able to continue using it because it's open source, you're out of luck. You're out of luck. They changed the license. And so the reason I highlight this is not to beat up on Elastic, but to highlight the importance of open governance and foundations. If a project is under an open source license and it belongs to a nonprofit foundation, then it will not be relicensed like this. You can have much greater trust and confidence that that software is going to be there for you to use in perpetuity, because they don't have that profit incentive to relicense it. In fact, that would be against their mission. They might lose their tax status if they do that. So, so while projects like Elasticsearch were open source, they had an open source license, they had open collaboration, certainly, but they did not have open governance. And because they didn't have open governance, it was vulnerable to this relicensing that has upset a lot of people. So I just want to highlight, like, these foundations are essential. Like, we can't do our work without them. We can't build our businesses without them. We can't, you know, We can't even like, there are a lot of humanitarian orgs who rely on open source software. There are a lot of people in places that can't afford to pay license fees who really lean on open source software. You look at like LibreOffice and Linux. These things make technology, open source makes technology accessible to a lot of people. And it's the foundations that keep it that way. So in closing, I want to talk just a little bit about how to get involved and why does it, so what there are foundations and they're important. Like what do we do about it? Foundations are just like open source projects. Maybe not just, but they're analogous. Like an open source project, foundations need new contributors. And so I encourage you to be one of those new contributors. Foundations often operate mailing lists or other sort of communication forums where you can either discuss the future of the Python language, discuss open source licenses, or discuss diversity and inclusion programs within the Kubernetes community. These foundations operate working groups, special interest groups, and steering committees that you can participate in. And even if you don't join them, there's often public comment periods where you can make your voice heard. And let me tell you, you should make your voice heard, because most of the people making their voice heard, they look like me. And like, this industry is, just like setting aside the fact that it's unjust, like that open source is practically white wall to wall, at least in the US. Like, it's also just boring, and we produce worse software. One of the things I forgot to say about open source that I think Llewellyn highlighted that reminded me was one thing that's said of open source software is many eyes mean shallow bugs. The more people who are working on something, the better, the more opportunities there are for us to solve problems and fix and solve problems before we even ship the software. And honestly, I think there's something similar that happens when we have representative teams working on software. If we don't have someone on the team who has accessibility issues, if we don't have someone on the team, then we might not think about the accessibility concerns. If we don't have someone on the team who has been a target of harassment or something, we might not think about the threat modeling and how our software could be abused to hurt them. And heck, if we don't have somebody on the team who speaks another language that's other than English, chances are the UI might not be responsive to, might not be easily localized. Maybe it's not going to support right to left languages out of the box. So there are all these things that, like, the more different perspectives and backgrounds we can bring into open source, the better the software is going to be. And so, like, the foundations are just the same. Like, we have a problem, and we need to bring more people into the fold. And we need to be intentional about who we're bringing into the fold. So I really encourage people to look at the foundations in this who are related to the software that you use, and find some way to get involved. Many of them have boards that you can run for. You can run for election. Oh, you can even work for a foundation. There are jobs there. Some of the foundations are larger than others. PSF indeed is only a few people. OSI is like only one full-time person. But you look at the Eclipse Foundation, who makes popular IDEs and does a lot in the Java space. That's a sizable operation. Software Freedom Conservancy, there are what, 5.5 people there. There are jobs at foundations, just like there are in the private sector. Foundations are also largely nonprofit. Some C6, some C3. I'm not going to bother talking about that distinction right now. But the bottom line is they tend to rely on donations and sponsorship. They don't have revenue streams. Ish. PyCon does. PyCon US is a profit center for PyCon that then subsidizes the grants programs and things like that. But by and large, these foundations don't have revenue, or don't have much revenue. And the pandemic has been unkind. No surprise, hasn't been good to any of us. So I encourage people to consider becoming a member of foundations. If you can afford to donate, please do. If you work for an employer who benefits from open source, and let me tell you, even if you're in the tech sector, you have an employer who does benefit from open source, try to convince them to sponsor one of these foundations. If nothing else, if you do nothing else after this conversation today, after this meetup, let some of your coworkers or your peers know about foundations, because it really is hidden infrastructure. This is stuff that like people do not think about. You know, I was in this industry for 13 years before I even realized these existed. And that's both a feature, like it's great that people can function in this industry without knowing these things exist, but it's also a threat, because the smaller the proportion of people in this industry who know that these foundations exist, that this hidden infrastructure makes all this possible, the more overburdened those organizations are going to be. And we need them to be there for us. So if I can ask one thing, please help me make it so this is no longer hidden infrastructure. And that's all I've got for you today.
That was even more awesome than I would expect it to be. Thank you, Josh. You weren't a backup. It was just that I'm lazy and waited till the very last minute to think about who could I get to talk that was interesting. But so much there that, you know, to talk about. Maybe we can do a future panel or something on some of the more serious issues. Like I said before, I don't want to get too political, but I have a lot of those same, I share a lot of those same thoughts and beliefs, and I am going to paste a link to your donation here and people can check it out.
Very kind of you, thank you. I
And
see
the
we've got
reason-
at least one question here.
Oh, go ahead. Or question for Josh.
Yeah, I'm just trying to just gain further understanding. So with OSI, I believe that Microsoft's effort to become more open source is ASP.NET. Right? Is that something that OSI would have evaluated? Or like, would you be looking at the ASP.NET portion, or are you looking at the licensing that they use to make their make ASP.NET open source?
That is a great question, Gary. Thank you. So looking at Microsoft and the .NET languages, that ecosystem in particular, there are a couple layers that so OSI concerns itself with the licenses and then tries not to get involved with the projects or assessing the organizations themselves. We try to sort of like, here's our ruler, please go use it. So OSI wouldn't necessarily wade into those issues itself, but what your question highlights that there are a couple different layers at which that licensing operates. The language itself is open source, right? Like, so Python is an open source language. .NET, as of the last decade, is an open source language. It wasn't at the start, but then they spun up the .NET Foundation, and it's an open source language now. So, and I believe that would mean that C#, ASP.NET, F#. I forget all the languages that are built on .NET, but yeah, those are all open source languages. And so that's the first layer at which, like, you know, we sort of interact with the licensing. Granted, unless you're doing language development, the licensing of the language tends not to matter a whole lot in practice, though I still always prefer open source languages. The layer at which we most often interact with licensing is the libraries that are written in said language, the frameworks that are written in said language. So Plone, Flask, Django, right? Those are all Python frameworks that are under an open source license. So in that case, you know, you've got open source language and an open source framework. .NET, same thing, you know, .NET open source language and I am way too, I don't know enough about that ecosystem to name a framework off the top of my head, but it's analogous. And really what you're looking for is when there's an open source license on that software that you're interacting with, that means that when we think about open source, there are usually 4 rights that we boil it down to. You have the right to use the software for free. You have the right to study the software for free, to like inspect it. You have the right to modify the software for free and do whatever the hell you want with it. Make it do flips, make it print everything bold. Doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want. And then lastly, it's use, study, modify, and then distribute. The last right that's really key in open source right licenses is not only can you look at the code, can you use it, can you modify it, but then you can share it. You can share it yourself. And that's what a lot of us do when we're like freelancing in particular. It's like, all right, well, someone's hired me to build them a WordPress website or a Django application. Okay, well, I don't own Django, but because it's under an open source license, I have these rights that allow me to modify it and then sell it and distribute it. I think I went a little beyond the scope of your question, but did I answer your question there, Gary?
Yes, sorry.
Awesome.
Josh, can you restate what Gary's question was? Because he was cutting out a little bit. I only heard part of it.
Yeah, so Gary, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the question as I understood it was like, okay, so let's look at Microsoft and the .NET languages. OSI, does OSI, like, how does OSI think about the licensing there of those languages? And the answer was like, OSI thinks about the licensing, but we don't wade into the details about, you're not going to see OSI have commentary about like, we're not going to be listing things that are open source or that we operate like one abstraction away from that, basically. Like we provide the ruler and then people go use it. And we occasionally have opinions when it's misused, but otherwise we don't say much about it.
I would just add that the fact that .NET is open source is kind of interesting. So much interesting stuff comes up. So thanks, Gary, for the question. Any more questions for Josh? By all means, please ask. I'm going to start wrapping up so we can cut out within the next 5 minutes. Thanks everyone for coming. It's so important. Or everyone that RSVPs and actually attends. We have a bit of a problem with RSVPs not turning into real people, which has transcended real life into these virtual meetings. I don't know if it's a meetup thing or what, but in any event, just so happy when people show up and participate. And I'm trying to remember the point I was going to raise. Oh yeah, so my personal mission is to continue to see that events like this happen, but I do have bigger ideas, and Josh mentioned that OSI is attempting to grow, and so you're really only limited by what people can are interested in helping you to do. So I would say to everyone who attends these meetings, become a meetup organizer and organize your own meeting or do a talk. Or there's nothing special about me. I'm just the guy who shows up and has the interest in doing so. So I'm really happy to see, that we've been able to transition into this virtual period, and hopefully we'll transition again out before too long. Okay, so let's see. I said my thank you. Thank you for everyone that donated. Please help Josh with some donations. I think that next month will be someone, might be Rami, I'm not sure, but I want to see, or I'm looking forward to seeing different people host. And I'm making a drama out of this because the cutoff is always really weird. I got my finger on the stop recording. If anybody has anything else to say in the last 30 seconds or so, please do let me know. Otherwise, cut out at 11:41-ish. Thanks all. See you next time.
Thank you for having me.